December 30th, 2019. I had just flown home after a 3-month stint in a Florida rehab for kratom, Adderall, and alcohol. I had put my family through hell that entire year, particularly my younger brother, who told me point blank that he couldn't live with me. I had a finite time to get a job and move out. I had spent the previous 4 years playing bass and vocals in his pretty successful band up until that point, and although I'd finally gotten my shit together, I'd ultimately proven to be a completely untrustworthy individual. I quickly got a job at a local electronics manufacturer and re-enrolled in college as I had been studying electrical engineering and was close to having my associates. Hell, I even had a small business building guitar pedals at one point. Despite this, my immature brain at the time simply could not cope with the thought of how badly I'd fucked up. And instead of powering through this like an adult or getting put on some kind of SSRI, which in hindsight I needed badly, I remembered that there was one opiate supposedly far better and far more euphoric than kratom: Tianeptine. I had never tried it myself. In fact, my only experience with it was watching a mutual friend battle with it years prior. As fucked up as it is, what made me actually want to seek out this stuff was diving into r/quitting Tianeptine and reading a plethora of horror stories how hard it was to quit. The reason being was that I figured that this was reflective of how strong the euphoria was. This is a glimpse into how weirdly autistic and immature my brain works when put under stress. I didn't want this stuff being shipped to my house unless I absolutely had to, so I googled around to see if any sketchy shops sold it locally. To my surprise, there was a small business on Google Maps listed in Kenosha called Tianeptine Friends, which had a website and was open 24/7 located in Kenosha, Wisconsin, just an hour or so from my house in Chicago. Curious, I called the number and a sickly high-pitched male answered in that stereotypical junkie drawl. I told him that I wanted 3 grams of sodium and 3 grams of free acid. He told me to drive to a specific speedway in a kind of seedy area of Kenosha. Despite giving him an hour heads up and telling him when I was leaving, he had me wait in that speedway parking lot for over an hour, which would become a semi-frequently recurring theme in the months to come. When he finally pulled up, I was greeted by the most smelly and disheveled man I had ever seen. I'm serious. The vast majority of homeless people I see walking around the streets of Chicago are more well-kept than he was. He was also one of the most fried pieces of literal shit I have ever met. I remember thinking that he looked a lot older than his voice would lead you to believe. He looked like a post-meth Elmer Fudd. I got my shit from him, paid, and then left. Effects-wise, I loved it more than heroin and every other opiate I had tried up until that point from the moment I felt it. It had a more uplifting, less downer feeling to it. I started using every day to ironically numb the constant thinking of the results of my previous shitty decisions. A couple weeks before the pandemic, I started renting out a band practice rehearsal space in the west side of Chicago with 24/7 access. When the pandemic laid everyone off, I had ample free time to get high and play my absolute nuts off for hours at a time. Though I technically shared the space with a few other bands, the pandemic canceled all shows for the foreseeable future, and I was the only one using it. My existence for the better part of the next 6 months was as follows: wake up, eat Tianeptine free acid, drive to the practice space, get more high, practice drumming for hours, occasionally record songs on guitar, and just generally bum around the space until I fell asleep there. I only really left the spot to pick up more Tianeptine from Kenosha, go home to shower, or donate plasma for Tianeptine money. While under the influence of other opioids, music didn't seem to interest me at all, but with Tianeptine, I would often get lost in music that I'd long since forgotten about. If timed right, taking a quarter spoonful of free acid after scoring, and blasting Language by the Contortionists as I hit the highway on my way home made the music like the first time I had heard it. Even though I'd long since stopped giving a shit about that specific kind of gent prog stuff since I started getting into good music and stopped being a teenager. Very early into the pandemic, one of my best friends, who was also my bandmate at the time, fucking died less than 8 hours after our last conversation. I promptly used this event to justify my stupid behavior going forward. Tianeptine has this weird effect on me where it actually gives me energy, enough to drum along to insanely fast and complicated songs for literal hours, especially when combined with 4-fluorophenibut. Nobody in the family really suspected me of relapsing because I was very in shape from the drumming, ripped in fact. There was a period of this summer when I tried to quit by using Suboxone, only to discover that subs give me all the bad effects of opiates and strip me of all my motivation to do anything productive. Like kratom, it left me feeling flat and unable to enjoy music. After weaning down and attempting to jump off at around 2 milligrams, I was left unable to sleep days on end unless the following criteria was met. Be drunk, fuck the hot-ass 19-year-old with thick hips and mommy milkers that I'd recently met, and chase it with a trazodone melatonin sandwich. No, I literally was unable to get more than 2 hours of sleep at night prior to having sex with her. After that, I got a solid 7. Being that I literally needed to fuck her in order to sleep, she rose to the top of my hierarchy of needs, which led me to being way clingy and scaring her off only a couple weeks into our thing. Shortly after she cut me off, I was in the parking lot of a Mexican restaurant in Round Lake when 2 guys started shooting at each other, with me directly in between them. After hightailing it out of there, I took this as a sign that life sucks, and therefore I will get more Tianeptine. I then started using Tianeptine again. Later that month, my smelly Tianeptine friend informed me that he had 3-chlorophenibut powder on hand, which is the active ingredient in baclofen. I wasn't using the chlorophenibut more often than a couple times every few weeks at the time, but decided to give it a go one day. Thing is, he neglected to inform me that without a tolerance, 50 milligrams is enough to put you on your fucking ass, which without a very good scale, is impossible to measure. I scooped what I thought was a very small amount on a butter knife and ate it, promptly blacking out and waking up 23 hours later with puke on my floor. I estimate that I must have taken at least 200 milligrams. When I finally regained my composure, I felt as if all mental barriers that existed for my CPTSD and generalized anxiety had faded away for good. I was completely present, not dissociated and clear-headed for what felt like the first time in my life. A very specific idea for a song came into my head that I couldn't get enough of, which sounded like a triumphant crescendo from hell. After getting on my phone, I received news that on the literal day and location that I went to go pick up my drugs, Kyle Rittenhouse had gunned down an associate of mine that frequented the same music scene I was involved with during the infamous Kenosha protests mere hours after I had left. Well, shit. The experience that made me quit this shit for good. It began like any other time I scored. I drove out to Kenosha and picked up approximately $75 worth of Tia-free acid and eyeballed a small amount on a plastic spoon before gulping it down and getting on the highway back home. I felt completely normal until stepping out of my car, which is when it hit me. Now, before I go on to explain what happened next, I have to emphasize that I had an extremely high tolerance for this crap, and anyone who has taken too much Tianeptine will tell you that it has sort of a ceiling effect similar to kratom, and that you just feel woozy and maybe throw up worst case scenario. This is not what happened. Upon stepping out of my car, I became extremely disoriented and found it very difficult to stand up. It felt like my driveway was slanted. It's very hard to explain exactly what this sensation was like, but I pretty much knew right then and there that I was fucked. I felt a pervasive sensation of needing to yawn, but it was to the point of being painful. I went inside and tried to convince myself that this was simply just a panic attack, pacing around the room, attempting to meditate, all the while I was getting more and more dissociated by the minute. I did some push-ups and smoked a cigarette, which is when I realized that my heart rate was extremely high. I called my dealer, asked him what the fuck was up, and if he cleaned the scale used to weigh my shit. I asked him if I should go to the hospital, to which he replied, "They wouldn't know how to deal with what you're going through." He actually suggested to come over to his house and let his equally fried dumbass of a wife monitor my heart while I slept. I tried explaining that I couldn't see straight at all, and I was losing my basic motor skills more and more by the minute. Even if I was dumb enough to trust his RC fried ass self with my life, there wasn't any way that I had the coordination to drive all the way back to Kenosha with my progressively deteriorating state. Possibly foreseeing what would happen next, I opted not to sleep in my room and decided to try and wait this out on the couch in the living room, just in case this became an emergency situation. Surprise, surprise, it did. I don't remember any of this, but apparently, my dad found me passed out on the couch and didn't think much of it until he nudged me to wake me. I promptly stood up, passed out, and hit my head on the floor. Cue the next thing that I actually remember. On the couch, I was surrounded by paramedics and unable to control my limbs. I was frantically flailing my arms and unable to stay still despite the paramedics asking me to. I felt trapped in my own body. "What did you take?" one paramedic asked several times. All that could come out of my mouth was a multi-pitched, "What?" I said this multiple times, all while flailing about and scaring the ever-living shit out of my family. My dad truly thought that this was the time that I, his first son, was going to die, or worse, permanently fuck my life up into becoming handicapped via severe brain damage. According to the hospital records I requested, this is when they sedated me with ketamine to calm me the fuck down. This caused me to have a very vivid dream that seemed to last around 2 weeks, involving me, one of the nurses, and driving around Bensonville in my van. In all reality, I was only out for about a day and a half. My coma dream was then interrupted by me waking up and projectile vomiting on the floor next to my hospital bed. I was in full-blown Tianeptine withdrawal and in the ICU. The nurses started asking me questions, and my answers to a lot of the basic ones like the date, my name, and the president, I either got wrong or took me too far long to figure out the answers to. For some reason, I refused to tell them about the Tianeptine that I took, despite being pressed about what drugs I had taken, out of fear of retaliation from my father. In hindsight, these fears were completely unfounded for a multitude of reasons, but I was still fucking delirious from whatever the fuck I took. I couldn't remember my father's phone number, despite knowing it by heart since I was 10 years old, and I was hallucinating very strange things which were compounded by the fact that I didn't have my glasses in there. Shortly after vomiting, I began having the absolute worst pain in my lower back to the point where I was screaming my fucking head off. The nurses told me to pipe down, but I physically could not. Now, I spiral fractured my tibia and fibula at 14 when skateboarding, which hurt like a bitch. But the pain I was currently feeling in my back was somehow 1,000 times worse. I've never had a history of self-harm, but I began violently biting and scratching my arms and hands to the point of drawing blood just to get my mind off of this pain, all while screaming bloody murder. This went on long enough for them to actually restrain my arms to the bedpost. I then started screaming stuff like, "Give me opiates, please! Fuck! Die! Please give me some fucking morphine, but a lot of it! I have a high opiate tolerance! Fuck!" They eventually relented and gave me 2 10mg hydrocodone, which I promptly chewed up and tossed back. After that, the pain still wouldn't go away. I continued screaming until they gave me Haldol, which knocked me the fuck out finally, but not before forcing all the piss out of my body and all over myself, because I couldn't piss into the bedside cup thingy when prompted for some reason. The next day, I was approached by a hospital psychiatrist who asked me the questions you'd expect. Had I tried to kill myself? Did I have any active thoughts of hurting myself or others, etc.? When she asked me if I experienced hallucinations, I distinctly remember seeing the blurry outline of what looked like a man on a horse right around my hospital room, hop onto the psychiatrist's clipboard, then under my bed. No, I replied, though this wouldn't be the last time they would come around and ask me questions along those lines, which I will get to later. I spent a total of 6 days in the ICU, and my memory is a bit fuzzy as to the order of the following events I'm about to describe, but I'll do my best to do so chronologically. My blood pressure was extremely elevated, and at one point, I asked if I could walk myself to the bathroom. My cardiovascular system was so fucked that I almost passed out after trying to stand up just for a few seconds while the machines monitoring my blood pressure went haywire. I opted to lay down and piss in the cup for the time being. "You know, you almost died," is what one of my bedside nurses told me. At one point during the night, a patient in the room next to me needed resuscitation. A hospital worker then grabbed the biggest defib paddles I have ever seen and attempted to revive the person. He then walked out of the room looking down at the floor, clapped the paddles together which created a shower of sparks, and walked off. Thinking that it may have been a vivid dream, I asked a doctor the following morning about it, and as it turns out, that really did happen. The dude died. Another fucked up thing I saw that I'm not entirely sure if it happened was seeing a guy with a full leg cast get the end of his foot stuck in one of the hospital doors that had started to lift him upwards and off his mobile stretcher. The whole staff was trying to free him as he was screaming. As this was happening, the TV in my room was playing a live feed of an x-ray view of the guy's leg as this was going on. After they finally managed to free him from the door by essentially forcing his leg to do the front splits, he started screaming and writhing in pain as a live feed of the internal parts of his leg showed a replay of something snapping in there. He started screaming and writhing in pain as the live feed of the internal parts of his leg showed a replay of something snapping in there, just over and over like a sports recap, an x-ray view of this guy's leg snapping. I remember this way too vividly, dream or not. I was experiencing the worst mental agony and physical pain of my life while in there, albeit not nearly as bad as when I first woke up. I was able to get fed a couple more rounds of Norcos to subside my withdrawals after I finally told them what I took. I was also told that my blood was sent off to poison control. A funny thing about opiate withdrawal that nobody seems to talk about is just how horny you get. This is due to the fact that while an active addiction, opiates actually tank your testosterone and make you not want to jerk off or even seek out sex. So when you quit, the opposite happens. 3 or so days into my stay, I couldn't handle it. Being in the ICU, you have a nurse in your room 24/7, and I didn't want to be a complete degenerate by blatantly jerking off in front of them. That being said, they were on their phones or work computers 99% of the time and not actively looking at me. And with my newfound sensitivity in the crotch area, I was able to adjust my blankets in such a way where you couldn't tell that I was moving at all, and come into prepared tissues in 20 seconds or less stealthily as fuck. I probably jerked off a minimum of 10 times a day for the remainder of my ICU career and never got caught, or make a sound even. One of my greatest achievements in life, probably above my engineering degree. Are you proud of me, Dad? Another side effect of opiate withdrawal is the return of creativity. I was coming up with mad song ideas, lyrics even. I wanted nothing more than to come home and play more stupid goofy avant-garde on my H-string. I realized on that hospital bed that while in active addiction, I was simply going through the motions when it came to music. I wasn't playing to play, hell, I barely recorded. I was just getting high and seeing how long I could maintain a 260 beats per minute blast beat while modifying pedals to make the kick drum mic in the practice space go through a compressor like a crackhead. I had several deep conversations with the various nurses in charge of keeping an eye on me, which made me realize how grateful I should be to be alive. One of them described how they survived a famine in Poland during the collapse of the USSR, and upon landing in the United States, she actually teared up at the sight of all the food inside of the first grocery store she went inside of. Another was from Northern Africa, where a civil war was currently taking place and the rest of her family was in constant danger. A third told me how an adverse reaction to a flu shot landed him in the ICU for a whole 8 months, and how he basically finessed his way out of having to pay a dime out of the 7-figure hospital bill without it affecting his credit. At some point, I was approached by another hospital psychiatrist who asked me the same round of questions, and being that I was at the lowest point of my life and finally able to cry due to not being numbed out, I started to sob like a little baby and told him about how much I wanted to kill myself and that I was sexually assaulted when I was 6. Because of this, I was discharged to the psych unit for a mandatory 72-hour hold after I was finally able to walk and my blood pressure returned back to normal. In the psych ward, I met a bunch of cool people who I still talk to, a fat dickhead who I ended up triggering, and most dishearteningly, a childhood friend of mine. This friend of mine had previously been missing for over 2 years out of state after having a mental break. This friend, who I reconnected with in our later teens, was always doing and selling hella drugs. Sometime after we reconnected when we were both 21, he apparently became a completely different person. After going MIA in California circa 2017, he had apparently become a meth-addicted vagrant on top of showing signs of severe schizophrenia. The person that stood before me in the psych ward in September of 2020 was not the same person I grew up with skateboarding when we were 12. Hell, it wasn't even the same person I did acid with in 2014. What stood before me was a wide-eyed, Sid Barrett of a man who would talk to himself when alone in his room and laugh like a maniac. During lunch, he would chew his food with his mouth open and sometimes not even use utensils like a fucking animal. This deeply disturbed me. At one point during group therapy, the therapist had a prompt and all of us would then answer it one by one. The prompt: if you had a magic wand, it could change one thing about the world, what would it be? Standard group innocuous therapy stuff, right? Wrong. When it got to this girl who I started befriending in there, she said that she wished that politicians would actually get stuff done. I piped up and said that the reason they don't currently work is because they're all pedophilic boomers who deleted all semblance of neuroplasticity by doing too much coke in the 80s. This made everyone laugh, including the therapist, all except for this one fat kid. He started going off on this gigantic tirade that went along the lines of, "I don't think that's funny, man. You're saying that these politicians, who swore on the Bible, are doing drugs? I'm in a secretive youth group for future leaders. We've met all the politicians. Fuck you. You're a piece of shit." He started punching walls and walking towards me. What was I thinking as this was happening? I was laughing my ass off, but a tad bit worried that if he swung at me, my PTSD and years of jujitsu would kick in, and then I would have to deal with a fat kid with a broken arm and potentially more time in that hellhole. Before he could swing at me, the therapist pushed the panic button, and he was promptly scooped up by security and a doctor. They booty juiced him, and the next time I saw him a few hours later, he was in a hell-all daze as he packed his stuff to be transferred to a higher security psych ward. Fucking idiot. Anyways, after my 72 hours was up, I was promptly set free and never touched that shit again because opiates are for pussies. Later in life, I ended up getting addicted to phenibut and amphetamines like a real man, but that story is for a different day. This experience traumatized me very deeply. For the next year or so, I began to have this reoccurring delusion where I was absolutely convinced in the back of my mind that I was still in that coma in real life due to how vivid the initial coma dream lasted. I ended up writing a song about this experience as well. For those interested, I'll put the link in the description. As of writing this, I finally kicked all substances and am 47 days sober after finding psych meds that help me address my CPTSD and depression without resorting to terrible decisions that inevitably lead me to ruining my life and almost dying. I have also received a formal diagnosis for autism spectrum disorder, which in hindsight was very fucking obvious to everyone but me.